Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and today we're going to be looking at a game from the FIDE World Rapid Championship Day 1. It is a game played by Nodirbek, Abdusattorov, and Magnus Carlsen, and Magnus has the white pieces, so he's going to start the game with b3. And this is called the Nimzo-Larsen attack, just making room for the dark square bishop to come to b2 and grab this long diagonal. Here, Nodirbek decides to just play solid, pushes e5, just grabbing control of the center of the board. Magnus does indeed fianchetto his dark square bishop. Nodirbek brings out his first knight to c6. And here Magnus plays e3, just making a way for his light square bishop to come out, maybe to e2 or even b5 would work. And also at some point he could push for advantage by pushing d4, and c4 would also work, just creating this pawn chain from a2 all the way to c4 would work as well. And here Nodirbek continues by bringing his other knight out to f6. Magnus continues by bringing his first knight out to f3. And the computer is saying, yeah, pinning the knight on b5 would have been a better move, but just slightly better. They're both fine moves. So knight f3, Nodirbek brings out his dark square bishop. And this kind of seems like a strange move. And yeah, it makes the evaluation saying that's a little bit better for white here, because this dark square bishop move to d6 is it's blocking this pawn from coming to d5 or d6. So the light square bishop will have a hard time getting out now because of that. But that's what he plays. And now Magnus plays c4. And this seems like an odd move. I mean, why wouldn't you just play c3 and then just make it to where you could push d4 and have a little bit more defense on that square? But the idea here is to bring your knight to c3 at some point and have already pushed c4, so you don't have to worry about blocking the c-pawn at that point. And Nodirbek continues by just simply castling. The computer saying he should have at this point pushed for e4, but then Magnus still indeed does have knight to d4, and then Nodirbek doesn't even have to take the knight at this point. He could just castle now, and it would be a better position for him after something like rook to e8. But okay, he doesn't do that. He instead decides to castle, which is fine. And here Magnus just pushes d3. I think he's just trying to grab a little bit more center of the board, which is good for him. Nodirbek decides to bring his rook to e8, which is a fine move. Always centralize or put your rooks on the middle two files is always a good idea. It's always an excellent move. And here the computer is liking this move, a5, and this is it's creating a little bit more counterplay on the queen side of the board for Nodirbek, because Magnus is taking up a lot of space on the queen side, so this would be an attempt to take back some of Nodirbek's space on the queen side as well. But he instead centralizes his rook, which is good. Magnus plays a3. I think what he sees here is he doesn't want Nodirbek to try and play something like this move. I think also that's why the computer was saying back here, instead of playing d3, you play c3 first, and then you can play d3 at some point if you wanted to, just to make it to where Nodirbek doesn't have any ideas of playing bishop to b4 and just checking the king. So I think that's why Magnus played this a3 push. Also, now the knight can't come to b4 and just cause trouble for this d3 pawn or something like that in the future. And here Nodirbek decides to finally play a5, just making it to where Magnus can't push this pawn to b4 and create more counterplay on the queen side. This would kind of cause a little bit of trouble for Nodirbek here. So that's the reasoning behind playing a5. And the computer here is suggesting, instead of playing a5, just bringing the bishop back to f8 and then making room for this d pawn to come up, maybe to d6 or to d5 to fight for the center a little bit more would have been a better option, the computer is saying. And after Nodirbek plays a5, Magnus continues development by just bringing his light square bishop to e2, making it to where he can castle a few moves from now, which is a good idea. And now Nodirbek does indeed bring his dark square bishop back to f8, making room for this d-pawn. Magnus castles, and Nodirbek pushes the d-pawn, also making it to where this light square bishop can come out possibly to e6 or to g4 would work as well, both fine moves. And here Magnus just simply takes. Nodirbek takes back, and Magnus develops this other knight to d2. I think he's trying to put a little bit more pressure on this e4 and c4 square. Just controlling a few more center squares is always a good idea. Nodirbek continues by creating this pawn chain all the way to e5. And this move, it might seem a little weird as well because it looks like you're opening up this file for the king. It's perfectly fine. After Nodirbek plays something like h8, it would be a fine position for him. I think he's also trying to stop this knight from jumping to g5 and then having some sort of counterplay on the king side. So that's the idea behind f6 here. And here Magnus just plays a calm and simple move, just making the queen a little bit more active on this open c file, which is why it's a pretty good move. Nodirbek develops his bishop to f5, trying to control this square. And now it looks like here that Magnus can win a piece by playing this e4 push. But actually this doesn't win a piece because now Nodirbek can play something like knight f4. And if Magnus takes the bishop, then Nodirbek can take Magnus's bishop, and after the king moves, then Nodirbek is fine after something like queen d5, just centralizing the queen, pushing for advantage on this e4 square. So this would actually be better for Nodirbek if Magnus decided to try and gain a piece from this, it looks like a blunder. But okay, after Nodirbek develops his bishop to f5, Magnus just, well, he obviously sees that you can't do this yet. So what he does is he plays rook e1. And what this does is he's centralizing or putting his rook on a middle file, and also he is protecting this light square bishop. So now, if Nodirbek tried to play something like, I don't know, something like pawn here, then Magnus could, after this, play this move. Because now this bishop is protected by the rook, so if Nodirbek tried to play this move, then Magnus could just simply take the bishop, and it would be a perfectly fine position for Magnus, and it would actually be a winning position for Magnus as well. So obviously, Nodirbek, being a grandmaster, sees that now Magnus could play this move, so he just simply drops his bishop back to g6 to avoid this e4 push. And Magnus here, he finds a very strange move, and the computer doesn't like it, but Magnus isn't playing against a computer. If you play this move against another human, they're not really going to know what to do because it looks like an odd move. Obviously, the computer would know what to do, but humans, they're a little bit more complicated in their thinking than just computers, so they don't really know what to do here. And overanalyzing is pretty easy to do in a chess game, and if you try and push something like f5, then Magnus is actually way better here after just g takes f5, and if Nodirbek takes back with the bishop, then Magnus actually has just this simple move where he simply moves his king to h1, and this makes room for the rook on e1 to come to g1 and create this attack on the king side. So that's why you would not want to try and confront this pawn head on. What Nodirbek decides to do instead is just simply move his queen up to d7 to calmly attack this pawn from a distance. And here Magnus just moves his king to h1, and it looks like he just leaves the pawn hanging here, but if Nodirbek tries to take the pawn, then this also is better for Magnus after something like knight to e5, and this is just making a double attack on the queen. It's also attacking this knight twice and this bishop, so here Nodirbek, he can't take the knight because then Magnus would just simply take his queen. And so he would have to play something like h4 and just simply move out of the way. And then after that, then Magnus has just rook takes, or knight takes on g6. And then after Nodirbek takes back, then Magnus could play something possibly like rook to g1 would work, or even queen c4 trying to go for a queen trade because Magnus's position here is just so much better than Nodirbek's. So that's why the pawn here is not actually hanging after h1. So Nodirbek seeing that, does not take the pawn. He just moves his other rook to the other center file, and here the computer's saying that instead of doing that, Nodirbek should have gone for something like knight to d8, and this move seems kind of weird as well. But the idea of this move is to just reroute your knight to f7 and then kind of protect this g5 square. So that'd be the idea behind that move. And then at some point after that, you could maybe move your rook to d8 would be fine. But instead, Nodirbek just simply does that immediately, making it to where now the knight cannot jump to d8. And so Magnus brings his knight to the center of the board, pushing it to e4. And I think he might have been trying to bait this move f5, which would have been fine for him after takes again. And then if Nodirbek retakes with the bishop, then he still has this nice open file here for the rook to come to g1, and this would be perfectly fine for him. So I think he was trying to bait that pawn push here, because that would be kind of the only way that you could try and get the knight away. If you try and just simply take with the bishop, then Magnus is simply just fine taking back, and this is actually better for him because this also dislodges this centralized knight on d5 as well, and then Magnus could still play something like g1 and then push for the advantage with g5. So it's kind of hard after this move to try and dislodge this knight. So Nodirbek just ignores the knight entirely and just moves his king to the side because he sees, well, Magnus is going to want to play rook g1 at some point, and I don't want my king to be on the same file as the rook. So he plays knight to h8. Magnus centralizes his other rook to d1. And here Nodirbek plays the best move, which is just dropping the light square bishop back, protecting this knight, also kind of indirectly attacking this b3 square and making room for these pawns to come up, because right here the pawn could not come to g6, but now it can. So it's just, there's a lot of different ideas with this move, bishop to f7, and that's why it's the best move. It's making a lot of things possible for Nodirbek to play. And here Magnus plays the best move. He just finally brings his rook to g1, defending this pawn, because as I said before, this pawn is not hanging in any of these moves. If at some point Nodirbek tries to take, then the pawn is not really hanging after something like knight takes e5. So that's why Nodirbek didn't take the pawn at any point during the game. And here rook to g1 finally protects the pawn. And now Nodirbek decides to create an attack of his own on the queen side. He's wanting to push this pawn to a4, and also now after he pushes it to a4, then he would kind of have an attack on this b3 square, and if he gets the b3 square with the light square bishop, then he could be potentially attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. So it would be a very deadly attack if he were to be able to follow up on it. And here Magnus just ignores what he's doing on the queen side. Magnus is trying to make him defend on the king side by bringing his rook up to g3 to try and rook lift possibly to h3 at some point. Would be a fine move after he brings his other rook to defend the pawn. And here Nodirbek just ignores what Magnus is doing and plays a4, going after this pawn. And if Magnus ignores the pawn here, if he ignores Nodirbek's pawn push and just plays something like rook g1, then this is a great position for Nodirbek after just something like pawn takes, or even the bishop could take. And this is now a passed pawn. It's also defended by the bishop because of the bishop moving back, and it's now attacking the queen as well. So it's a monster pawn at this point. So Magnus here does not ignore the pawn. He instead, and if you try and push, if you push the pawn here, that's also not a very good move, because then Magnus has this bishop to b3 move, and this would just be pinning the queen to the rook. So instead, Magnus sees that neither of those options work, so he just takes the pawn on a4. Nodirbek, instead of taking the pawn, he moves the knight out of the way, so now there's a double attack on the pawn, so now he could take next move potentially. And here Magnus just ignores it, moves his other rook to g1, creating more chances of attacking the king. And Nodirbek, he tries to go after this odd structure that Magnus has, where he has the knights on the same diagonal as the king. So I think that's what he's trying to create counterplay. It's not really working out for him, so Magnus just finds the best move in the position, which is to just push for more. He just pushes the pawn up to g5, asking Nodirbek, well, do you want to take the pawn, and then I have more advantage? If he takes, then Magnus has something like he could take with the knight on e4. He could take, well, actually, he could take with any of the pieces, really. Any of these takes would be fine for Magnus. So here, after Magnus pushes, Nodirbek decides, I can't really take the pawn because that would just create an open file for Magnus, so I have to push and just attack this knight twice. Magnus, instead of moving here with the knight, he moves back, not wanting to be too risky with his moves. I'm sure he didn't really like this idea of giving up the knight, and he wasn't really too sure if it would lead to checkmate or not, so he didn't want to follow this line. Although this does look very good for Magnus, after something like queen to c6, then it's still a pretty much even game. So I'm sure Magnus was reluctant for this reason to just sacrifice pieces to gain a small advantage. So instead he just simply moves back with the knight to c3, attacking this bishop. And Nodirbek here just moves the bishop back because he doesn't want Magnus to take it. He also doesn't want to trade the bishop for this knight, because bishops are usually worth more than knights in the middle game to end game. They're usually a little bit better. And he also wants to go after this pawn because now this pawn is triple attacked, and he wants these pawns to fall so then he can push his B and C pawns and try and get a passed pawn to promote. And here Magnus, just ignoring this threat of taking, he simply strikes in the center, trying to remove this pawn and get his pieces closer to the king side. And here Nodirbek takes. Magnus retakes, Nodirbek takes, and then Magnus just calmly plays queen c3. And what this does is this attacks this undefended knight on a5. It also triple attacks this pawn, the central pawn on e5. And so what would you play here if you were Nodirbek? Because this knight's hanging, it looks like this pawn's about to fall, and what Nodirbek plays is he just plays this knight back move, and he's trying to hang on to this central pawn. Better would have been something like creating a different threat instead of trying to defend this hard to defend pawn. You would just create another threat by attacking this rook, and then after the rook moves, then you would be fine. But instead, Nodirbek tries to hang on to the pawn. Magnus, ignoring that he could potentially, I think he could still take. I want to see if he can. If Magnus takes here, then Nodirbek, no, okay, he can't take. So instead of just blundering the game by taking, Magnus continues by pushing the pawn to g6, creating more threats. And here, if Nodirbek takes the pawn with his pawn, then it would be much better for Magnus after rook h3, and Magnus now just has this open file hitting the king, and after the king moves, then it's now on the same file as this rook, and now also there is a battering ram coming with the queen and the bishop on this same square. So it'd be very hard for Nodirbek to win this game at this point. So after this move, he does not take the pawn. He instead brings his knight to d4, just blocking this attack from the queen and the bishop on this diagonal, and also hitting this knight and the bishop at the same time. And here Magnus finds a brilliant move, and this is the first brilliant move that Magnus finds. And it looks like the bishop's hanging here. And if Nodirbek decides to take the bishop, then this leads to a variation or a line where Nodirbek actually has to give up his queen or lose the game, because here Magnus has queen c4. And what this is doing is this is threatening. It doesn't look like it's threatening checkmate, but it actually is. It'd be a forced checkmate if Nodirbek does not play this right. And if he plays something like, well, if he plays the best move and just plays knight g1, then Magnus has this knight to f7 idea. And this is why this is a brilliant, or the move to knight to g5 was a brilliant move, because now if Nodirbek does not take the knight and just moves something like back here, or just moves here instead to not give up the queen, then this would actually be checkmate in 2 moves after knight to h6, and the pawn cannot take the knight because there is a double attack on the king. So the pawn taking the knight would not stop this check that the queen on c4 is delivering to the king. So the king has to move, and after the king moves, then this is just simply checkmate, and it would just be like a nice smothered mate on the king on h8. So here Nodirbek would actually have to take the knight here, and then after Magnus retakes, and then Nodirbek plays something like rook to e7, then Magnus could take this bishop, and then after Nodirbek plays knight to e2, then this is just, it's a winning position for Magnus, because he basically has a queen for a rook and a bishop, but he's just kind of better here. Overall, his pieces are a little bit more active. This rook's hitting this square, this bishop's on the same diagonal as it, and his queen, it would be easy for it to come up here and then just try and pick up these pawns. So that's why this right here was a brilliant move, because it kind of leads to the queen coming to c4, and then it making it to where Nodirbek would have to give up his queen, but Magnus actually misses this idea. After knight takes here, instead of just simply moving the queen up to c4, he actually decides to move his knight to f7 immediately, and this does not lead to the same result. Here Nodirbek does indeed take the knight, and it looks like you're just getting a queen for a knight, but you're actually not. After Magnus retakes, Nodirbek takes Magnus's knight, and then Magnus takes the rook, and here after captures on e8, Magnus captures the knight on c3, and Magnus is just up the exchange here. So he's not as good as his position would have been if he had played queen c4, but he's still a little bit better here because he is up the exchange and his pieces are just more active. So Nodirbek continues by bringing his light square bishop out to g6. The computer is saying that he should have just pushed this pawn to try and gain a little bit of an edge on Magnus by trying to disrupt this battering ram with the rooks. But he plays bishop g6, and after Magnus takes, because he did not move the pawn from f5, Magnus can just simply take, and then after Nodirbek takes, then Magnus takes the pawn on e5. And now Nodirbek doesn't really have any more pawns like that can come to the center of the board. I mean, he does have this c pawn, but that's not really going to help much from these the f pawn and the d pawn coming and attacking the center of the board. So it's not really going to help much at this point. And here Nodirbek just decides to try and grab, because they're just grabbing a bunch of pawns here. Nodirbek decides to grab another one of Magnus's pawns. And it looks like this is a fine take because, well, it's defended by the rook, but actually Magnus has his second brilliant move here, which wins him the game, and it is rook to g7. And here, if Nodirbek plays the best move, which is takes, then Magnus just simply has retakes on g7, and now there is this discovered check coming, and the king can't really move to any other square to get away from the discovered check, so it's just the king's just sitting there, and after something like rook to d5, the computer is suggesting, then Magnus can just simply play something like rook here and just defend the bishop while also checking the king. And after something like rook takes, because if the rook did not take here, it would just simply be checkmate. Then Magnus is up the exchange still, and this is just a winning endgame for him. So after this brilliant g7 rook g7 move, then Nodirbek just simply resigns because there's no point in continuing the game because Magnus's position is just much better here. And so this is a kind of an interesting game to watch for me, but it was kind of sad that he missed this idea of after knight takes on e2 that he could have just gone queen c4 and then just basically it would have been a nicer win because he would have followed the best line that the computer is suggesting. It kind of would have been a little bit cooler, but it's fine that he missed it. I mean, you can't always find the best move. And he still is leading. As of right now, he's leading in the tournament. I think he has like 4.0 he has like 4 points. And I think there's a few other people that have 4 points as well, like Anishigiri and a few others. But he's still leading in the tournament. And if he just continues like this and plays very good chess, I would assume that he'd be able to win the tournament, but I'm not sure yet. So I hope y'all enjoyed this analysis video. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, and thanks for watching.